The Nag Hammadi library, buried in an earthen jar near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi in 1945, contained 13 leather-bound papyrus codices that the early Christian church had spent centuries trying to erase from human memory. Among these texts, the Gospel of the Egyptians and the Secret Book of John describe something the institutional church could never allow to become common knowledge. Jesus did not pray to God through supplication, begging, or worship. He spoke 7 specific names, each calibrated to different frequencies of divine reality, each one literally opening what the texts call monad gates, portals through which human consciousness could traverse the layers of reality that the archons, those intermediary beings between humanity and the divine source, desperately wanted to keep sealed. These were not metaphors, these were not symbolic representations of spiritual states. These were precise vocal formulas, sonic keys that Jesus taught to his closest disciples, techniques so powerful that the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE specifically targeted any text containing these practices for destruction. The archons, operating through the religious and political structures of the time, understood that if humanity learned these 7 names, if people discovered they could directly access the monad without priestly intermediaries, without church institutions, without the entire apparatus of control that had been erected between human beings and divine source, their system of spiritual imprisonment would collapse. This is not about belief. This is about practice. This is about technique. And you are ready for this knowledge because you have already sensed that something fundamental has been hidden from you, that the spirituality you were given was designed to keep you seeking rather than finding, that the real teachings, the operational teachings, were buried specifically so you would remain dependent on external authorities for your connection to the divine. The 7 sacred names that Jesus used are recorded across multiple Gnostic texts, but the most complete transmission appears in a Coptic manuscript discovered among the Nag Hammadi codices, specifically in a text called the Holy Book of the Great Invisible Spirit, also known as the Egyptian Gospel. This text was written sometime between the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, making it contemporary with or earlier than many of the texts that were eventually canonized into the New Testament. The manuscript describes Jesus gathering his disciples after the resurrection, not to give them theological doctrine, but to teach them the operational mechanics of consciousness. He told them explicitly that during his earthly ministry, he had used 7 names in sequence during his most profound spiritual work, during his healings, during his confrontations with what the canonical Gospels called demons, but what the Gnostic texts identified more precisely as archontic entities, and during his prayers in the garden and on the cross. These names were not addresses for different gods or angels. They were 7 distinct vibrational patterns that corresponded to 7 levels of reality between the material realm and the monad, the ultimate source that cannot be named or comprehended, but can be directly experienced. Each name functioned as a sonic key that opened a specific gate, a portal in consciousness that allowed the practitioner to move through the layered structure of reality that the ancient Gnostics mapped with remarkable precision. Before we examine each of the 7 names individually, you need to understand the cosmological framework within which they operate, because these names do not work within the simplified heaven and earth model that most religious traditions present. The Gnostic cosmology, which Jesus was teaching according to these suppressed texts, describes reality as a series of concentric spheres or realms, each governed by different principles and different entities. At the outermost level, you have the material realm, what the Gnostics called the kenoma, the emptiness, the realm of deficiency. This is the physical world as we normally experience it, the realm of matter, time, decay, and death. One level inward from the material realm you encounter the first of the archontic spheres. The archons are described in these texts not as purely evil beings, but as limited, ignorant entities who believe themselves to be ultimate and who seek to keep human consciousness trapped in the outer realms because they feed on the emotional and spiritual energy that humans produce. The chief archon, sometimes called Yaldabaoth or the Demiurge, is described as having created the material world as a prison because he himself did not know that higher realms existed beyond his own sphere of awareness. This is crucial. The archons are not all-powerful cosmic villains. They are ignorant wardens who genuinely believe they are the highest authority, and their power over humanity exists only to the extent that humans remain ignorant of the higher realms. Moving inward through the cosmology, beyond the archontic spheres, you reach what the texts call the pleroma, the fullness, the realm of the aeons. The aeons are divine emanations, perfect expressions of different attributes of the ultimate source. These are not gods to be worshipped, but rather states of consciousness, modes of existence that human beings can access and embody. The names that Jesus taught are designed to facilitate movement through these realms, to carry consciousness inward from the material level through the archontic barriers, through the various levels of the pleroma, until finally reaching the monad itself, the unknowable source from which all reality emanates. The 7 names correspond to 7 major thresholds in this journey, 7 gates that must be passed through in sequence for consciousness to complete the full circuit from embodied material existence to source awareness and back again. The first of the 7 names is recorded in the Coptic text as I-E-O-U, pronounced in English phonetics as E-I-O-U. This name corresponds to the gate between the material realm and the first level of subtle or etheric reality. When Jesus spoke this name, according to the accounts in the Gospel of the Egyptians, he was establishing a vibrational bridge between his physical body and his etheric body, the subtle energy structure that interpenetrates and extends slightly beyond the physical form. The practice of speaking this name is described in technical detail in another Nag Hammadi text called the Books of Zhu, which contains what appears to be a training manual for early Christian initiates. To work with the first name, the practitioner is instructed to sit in a quiet place, preferably at dawn or dusk when the energetic threshold between day and night creates a natural opening in the fabric of the material realm. You begin by placing your awareness in your physical body, feeling the weight and density of matter, feeling the boundaries of your skin, feeling the way your physical form is separate from the space around it. Then you speak the name I-E-O-U, but not as a word addressed to something external. You speak it as a statement of identity, as a declaration that you are the meeting point of matter and spirit, that your being contains both the density of the physical and the subtlety of the etheric. The texts describe the proper pronunciation as beginning with a high tone on the E, descending through I, levelling on O, and descending further on U, creating a downward sonic cascade that the practitioner is meant to feel vibrating first in the crown of the head, then moving down through the throat, the heart, and finally settling in the solar plexus. The effect that practitioners report when working with this first name consistently over a period of days or weeks is a distinct shift in bodily awareness. You begin to sense that your physical body is not the solid, fixed thing you always assumed it to be, but rather a condensed pattern of energy that is constantly in flux, constantly exchanging information and substance with the environment around it. This is not imagination. This is not visualization. This is a direct somatic experience that becomes undeniable once the first gate begins to open. You start to feel the etheric body as a distinct layer of sensation, a kind of tingling or streaming that moves through and around the physical form. People often describe it as feeling like they're breathing through their whole body rather than just their lungs, or as feeling like their edges are less defined, as if they extend a few inches beyond their skin in all directions. This is the first gate opening, the first monad gate. the threshold between dense matter and subtle energy. Jesus taught this first name as the foundation of all the subsequent work, because if you cannot differentiate between your physical body and your etheric body, if you cannot establish conscious awareness in that first subtle layer, you cannot proceed deeper into the structure of reality. The archons, according to the texts, work very hard to keep human awareness locked exclusively in the physical body, because as long as you identify completely with your dense material form, you cannot access the higher levels where their control breaks down. The second of the 7 sacred names is recorded as Alpha Omega Sabaoth, pronounced A-O Sabaoth. This name operates at a completely different frequency than the first. Where I-E-O-U opens the gate between physical and etheric, A-O-Se-Bei-A-O-T-H opens the gate between the etheric body and what the Gnostic texts call the astral or emotional body. This second layer of subtle reality is where emotions, desires, and thought forms have actual substance, where consciousness begins to encounter entities and energies that do not have physical form but are absolutely real in their own domain. The name Sabaoth appears in the Hebrew Bible as one of the titles of Yahweh, usually translated as Lord of Hosts or Lord of Armies, but the Gnostic texts give this name a completely different function. In the secret book of John, Sabaoth is described as one of the archons who repented, who recognized the existence of higher realms beyond his own, and who became an ally to those seeking to escape the control of the demiurge. By speaking this name, Jesus was not calling on an external deity, but was activating a specific quality of consciousness, the quality that allows awareness to detach from identification with emotional energy while still remaining present to it. The practice with the second name builds directly on the foundation established with the first. Once you've spent enough time working with I-E-O-U that you can reliably feel the distinction between physical and etheric, you proceed to the second gate. The instructions in the books of Zhu describe this practice as taking place in 3 phases. First, you establish yourself in etheric awareness using the first name, feeling that streaming, tingling quality that indicates the first gate is open. Second, you shift your attention to your emotional state, whatever it happens to be in that moment, whether calm or agitated, content or disturbed, and you observe how emotions appear not as abstract mental concepts, but as actual energetic sensations that move through the etheric body like currents or waves. Third, you speak the name Alpha Omega Sabaoth, and the texts are very specific about the pronunciation here. R is spoken from deep in the chest with the mouth wide open. O is spoken with a rounder, more focused sound, bringing the lips together, and Sabaoth is articulated clearly with emphasis on the bar syllable, creating a rhythmic pulse. The entire name is meant to be spoken on a single exhalation, with the practitioner feeling the sound resonating first in the heart center, then expanding outward through the entire etheric field. What happens when this second gate opens is that you gain the capacity to witness emotional energy without being swept away by it. This is not the same as suppressing emotions or pretending they do not exist. It is the development of a distinct center of awareness that can observe emotional currents moving through your system while remaining stable, untouched by their movement. The texts describe this as standing in Sabaoth, as finding the place of sovereignty within the emotional realm. Practitioners report that after working with this name consistently for several weeks, they begin to notice that emotions which previously felt like unstoppable forces, feelings like rage or despair or overwhelming desire, start to appear as weather patterns moving through consciousness, powerful but impermanent, demanding attention but not demanding identification. This is where the archontic system of control begins to break down in a serious way, because the archons, according to the Gnostic teachings, exercise much of their influence over humanity through emotional manipulation, through the generation of fear, desire, anger, and despair that keep consciousness trapped in reactive patterns. When you develop the capacity to witness these emotions without being controlled by them, when you can stand in the sovereign space that Sabaoth represents, you're no longer as easily manipulated by the forces, both internal and external, that seek to keep you in a state of reactivity and unconsciousness. The third sacred name is Alpha Omega Prophanthi, Ao Prophantes, and this name marks a significant threshold in the sequence because it opens the gate between the emotional body and the mental body, between the realm where feelings have substance and the realm where thoughts and concepts create actual structures in consciousness. The term Prophantes does not appear in mainstream biblical texts, but it shows up repeatedly in the Nag Hammadi literature, particularly in the Pistis Sophia, a lengthy Gnostic text that records extended teachings attributed to the risen Jesus. Prophant is described as one of the higher aeons, a divine emanation associated with revelation, with the capacity to perceive truth directly rather than through the filtering mechanisms of belief and conceptual overlay. This third name is considered one of the most challenging to work with because it requires the practitioner to confront the extraordinary power that thoughts have to create and maintain entire reality tunnels, entire self-consistent worlds of interpretation and meaning that feel absolutely true from within, but that are ultimately constructions, patterns of mental energy that can be dissolved and reformed. The practice with the third name demands that you first stabilize your awareness in the second gate, in that place of emotional witnessing that Sabaoth opens. You need to be able to maintain stability in the face of emotional energy before you can begin to work with the even more subtle level of mental energy. The instructions for this practice describe beginning with what the texts call the examination of beliefs. You choose a single belief that you hold about yourself, about others, about the nature of reality, and you hold it gently in awareness, not trying to determine whether it is true or false, but simply observing how it appears as a structure in your mind, how it has a certain shape, a certain weight, a certain emotional charge associated with it. Then you speak the name Alpha Omega Prophanthi with a very specific intention. You're asking to see beneath the belief, to perceive the level of reality that exists prior to the formation of concepts, prior to the division of experience into categories and judgments. The pronunciation requires careful attention. R-O is again spoken from the heart center, establishing continuity with the previous names, while Prophantes is articulated with each syllable receiving equal emphasis, creating a steady, unwavering rhythm. The entire name should be felt vibrating in the region of the forehead and crown, in the areas that correspond to what later spiritual traditions would call the third eye and crown chakras. When the third gate begins to open, practitioners describe an experience that can be disorienting at first. Thoughts become visible as objects rather than being identified with as self. You start to see how a thought arises from a deeper level of mind, takes form as a particular concept or image, persists for a duration, and then dissolves back into the background field of consciousness. The texts warn that this stage of practice can be destabilizing because so much of what we call the self is constructed from habitual patterns of thought. And when those patterns become visible as mere patterns rather than as reality itself, there can be a temporary sense of groundlessness, a feeling of not knowing who or what you are if you are not your thoughts. This is why the sequence of names must be learned in order. If you try to work with the third name without having established stability at the levels of the first and second names, without being grounded in somatic awareness and emotional witnessing, the dissolution of mental structures can feel like a loss of self rather than a liberation from a limited self-concept. But for those who progress through the sequence properly, the opening of the third gate brings an extraordinary freedom. The freedom to choose which thoughts to engage with and which to let pass. The freedom to construct interpretations of experience that serve growth and awakening rather than being trapped in inherited patterns of belief that were never consciously chosen. The fourth sacred name is Alpha Omega Omega Bastra, ROO Bastra, and with this name, we enter into territory that the texts describe as beyond the archontic spheres. The first three gates move consciousness through the levels that the archons have direct influence over: the physical body, the emotional currents, and the mental formations. The fourth gate opens into what the Gnostic texts call the first level of the pleroma, the realm of divine fullness, and specifically into the domain that Bastra governs. Bastra is described in the Pistis Sophia as an aeon of purification, but not purification in any moral sense. This is purification of consciousness itself, the removal of the layers of conditioning, habit, and karmic residue that obscure the inherent clarity of awareness. The practice with the fourth name is described as requiring solitude and extended time, because unlike the first three names, which can be worked with in relatively short sessions, the fourth name initiates a process that unfolds over hours and days, a process of deep cleansing that moves through all the layers that have been opened by the previous practices. The instructions for working with Alpha Omega Omega Bastra specify that the practitioner should undertake a period of simplification before beginning this practice. Simple food, minimal social interaction, reduction of sensory input, creating conditions that allow consciousness to settle into its own depths without constant disturbance from external stimuli. The texts recommend a 3-day preparation period, though modern practitioners have found that even a single day of simplification can create enough space for the practice to begin working. The name itself is pronounced with a triple ROO opening, a cascading triple descent through the same vowel pattern used in the first two names, and then Bastra is spoken firmly, grounding the energy. The entire name should be felt resonating through the core of the body, not in any particular chakra or energy center, but through the central channel, the vertical axis that runs from crown to base of spine. Practitioners are instructed to speak this name repeatedly, not in a mechanical way, but with full presence, feeling each repetition as a wave of energy that moves through the entire system, clearing and opening. What practitioners report when the fourth gate opens is difficult to convey in language, because it involves the dissolution of the very structures that language depends on. There is a sense of vast spaciousness opening up within consciousness, a spaciousness that was always there but that had been obscured by the density of physical sensations, emotional currents, and mental formations. This spaciousness is not empty in the sense of being void or blank, rather it is pregnant with potential, vibrating with what the texts describe as the light of the pleroma, a quality of luminosity that does not come from any external source, but that appears to be the natural radiance of consciousness itself when it is no longer obscured. Many practitioners describe this stage as involving spontaneous insights into the nature of suffering, into the mechanics of how consciousness creates its own bondage through identification with temporary phenomena. These are not intellectual insights that come from thinking about suffering. They're direct perceptions that arise when consciousness becomes clear enough to see its own operations. The texts emphasize that this fourth gate is where many practitioners plateau, where the journey stops for those who become attached to the peace and clarity that this level brings, and they warn that while this level is profoundly different from ordinary consciousness, it is still not the final destination, still not the monad itself. The fifth sacred name is Ao, A-E-O, E-A-A-O, and this name marks the transition from purification to illumination, from clarity to gnosis in its most technical sense, direct knowing that transcends both belief and experience. The structure of this name is noteworthy because it contains 4 vowels that create an ascending-descending pattern. E is high, R descends, I rises slightly, O settles. This pattern is described in the text as mirroring the movement of consciousness in the 5th level, where awareness begins to oscillate between individual perspective and universal perspective, between the sense of being a localized point of consciousness and the recognition of being the infinite field of consciousness itself. IAEO appears in the Gospel of the Egyptians in the context of the baptismal formula that Jesus gave to his disciples, not baptism with water, but what the text calls baptism in the living water, which is clearly describing an initiation of consciousness rather than any physical ritual. The name IAEO is spoken as part of the process through which the initiate recognizes their own divine nature, their own identity with the source of all being. The practice with the fifth name requires that the practitioner has stabilized the clarity achieved through the fourth gate. You must be able to rest in that spacious awareness before attempting to work with our IAEO, because this name does not open a gate in the same way the previous names do. Rather, it dissolves the sense of there being a gate at all, dissolves the sense of there being a journey from here to there, from ignorance to enlightenment. The instructions describe beginning the practice by resting in the clarity of the fourth level, in that luminous, spacious awareness, and then speaking the name IAEO with the recognition that the one speaking the name and the reality the name invokes are not two different things. This is not about calling something to you. This is about recognizing what you already are. The pronunciation flows as a single continuous sound, with each vowel blending into the next, creating a sonic wave that the practitioner feels vibrating simultaneously in the heart and crown, establishing a direct connection between these two centers that the texts describe as the axis of gnosis. When the fifth gate opens, or more accurately, when consciousness recognizes that there never was a gate, practitioners describe entering into what the texts call the state of the alone to the alone. This is not aloneness in the sense of isolation or separation. It is the recognition that at the deepest level, there is only one consciousness, one awareness looking out through infinite perspectives. Practitioners report moments where the boundary between self and other becomes transparent, where it becomes directly obvious that the awareness looking out through your eyes is the same awareness looking out through every other pair of eyes, that the sense of being a separate individual is a functional convenience for navigating the material realm, but not an ultimate truth. The texts are very clear that this recognition is not meant to obliterate the functional sense of individuality. You do not lose your personality or your ability to navigate daily life. Rather, you gain the capacity to shift between individual and universal perspective at will, to function as an individual when that is appropriate, while knowing that the individual is an expression of something infinitely larger. This is the level at which the archontic control system completely breaks down, because the archons depend on beings believing they are fundamentally separate, fundamentally alone, fundamentally in competition for limited resources. When consciousness recognizes its own infinite nature, when it directly knows itself as the source rather than as a fragment separated from the source, the entire logic of the archontic system becomes irrelevant. The sixth sacred name is Alpha Omega Iota, Omega Sigma Chi Eta Lambda, A-O Io-A Se-El, and this name functions at a level that the texts struggle to describe, because language itself begins to break down when pointing to realities this subtle. Iwasel is mentioned in the Apocryphon of John as one of the highest aeons, associated with the faculty that the text calls divine providence, the aspect of the monad that guides all beings back to their source, not through external intervention, but through the inherent structure of consciousness itself, which naturally moves toward awakening when obstacles are removed. The sixth name is described as opening the gate between individual gnosis, the direct knowing of one's own divine nature that the fifth name reveals, and what the texts call cosmic gnosis, the knowing of the divine nature of all reality, the recognition that the entire manifest universe is not something separate from the monad, but is the monad expressing itself in infinite forms while never ceasing to be one undivided whole. The practice with alpha, omega, iota, omega, sigma, chi, eta, lambda is described only in fragments across the various texts because this level of work was considered the most sacred, the most carefully guarded of all the teachings. What we can piece together from the surviving manuscripts indicates that this practice was done in community rather than in isolation, that it required the presence of at least one other practitioner who had opened the sixth gate themselves. The reason for this requirement is that at this level, consciousness begins to merge and blend with other consciousness in ways that can be destabilizing if done without proper guidance. The texts describe a practice where two or more initiates would sit facing each other, would first establish themselves in the clarity of the fourth gate and the gnosis of the fifth gate, and would then speak the name Alpha, Omega, Iota, Omega, Sigma, Chi, Eta, Lambda in unison, allowing their individual awareness to merge into a shared field. The pronunciation requires all participants to synchronize their breath and their tone, creating a unified sound that vibrates through the space between them, literally creating what the texts describe as a doorway in the middle distance, a portal that opens not within any individual consciousness, but in the field that is generated when two or more awakened beings come into coherence. What happens when the sixth gate opens is described in the texts with language that sounds almost science fictional. Consciousness becomes non-local, meaning it's no longer confined to the individual body-mind but extends through what the texts call the web of light that connects all beings. Practitioners report experiences of knowing what others are thinking or feeling without any sensory communication, of perceiving events happening at a distance, of accessing information that has no normal means of transmission. The Gnostic texts do not present these phenomena as supernatural powers, but rather as natural capacities of consciousness that become available when awareness is not limited by identification with a single physical form. This is the level at which the term Christ consciousness in the Gnostic texts becomes comprehensible, not as a title belonging to one historical individual, but as a state of consciousness characterized by this non-local awareness, this capacity to know and care for all beings, because the boundaries that seem to separate beings are perceived as transparent. The texts repeatedly emphasize that this level is not the goal in itself, but is rather a necessary stage in the journey toward the seventh and final gate, toward the ultimate return to the monad. The seventh sacred name is the most controversial and the most protected of all the teachings. Ma, Yauth, Varvilo, Ma, I, A, Oth, Ba, Belo. This name appears in the Gospel of the Egyptians in the context of the highest mysteries, and the text explicitly states that this name was only to be spoken by those who had successfully opened all 6 previous gates, because speaking this name without the proper preparation would be like trying to contain the entire ocean in a cup. The consciousness would simply be overwhelmed and scattered. The structure of this name is unique among the 7. The triple repetition of Ma, which in Aramaic can mean Lord, but in the Gnostic context means something closer to awakened master, or one who has realized, followed by the divine name Iaoth, a variant of the tetragrammaton that appears throughout Gnostic literature, and concluding with Varvilo, Barbello, who is described in multiple Gnostic texts as the first emanation from the monad, the divine mother, the womb from which all the aeons emerge. This name is essentially invoking the complete circuit of emanation and return, calling upon the realized masters, the divine name of the source, and the primordial mother through whom all manifestation flows. The practice with this 7th name is described in the most fragmentary and cryptic terms across the surviving texts, and scholars debate whether the obscurity is due to the loss of manuscript material or to intentional encoding meant to prevent this practice from falling into unprepared hands. What we can reconstruct suggests that the 7th gate is not opened through repetitive practice or through extended meditation sessions, but through a single moment of complete surrender, a total release of the will to control that has been driving the entire journey up to this point, the texts describe a paradox. You must use will and effort to open the first 6 gates. You must apply yourself with discipline and consistency to move through each level, but the 7th gate only opens when you release all effort, when you stop trying to get anywhere or achieve anything, when you become so completely present in the nowness of being that there is no longer a self separate from existence, trying to attain something called enlightenment. The name Ma 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 Iao Varvilo is spoken, according to the fragments, only once, at the moment when this surrender becomes complete, and the speaking of the name is not an action taken by an individual but rather the universe speaking through the form of the individual, consciousness recognizing and naming itself. When the 7th gate opens, the texts say that what happens cannot be described because the one who could describe it is no longer present as a separate entity. This is not death, not annihilation, but rather complete transparency to the source. The individual continues to exist, continues to function, continues to move through the material world, but they know themselves as the monad playing at being an individual rather than as an individual seeking the monad. This is what the Gnostic Christians meant by resurrection. Not the resuscitation of a corpse, but the awakening of consciousness to its own deathless nature, its own identity with the source that was never born and can never die. The texts suggest that Jesus himself existed in this state, that his teaching mission was not to get people to believe in him as a unique divine being, but to show them that the same realization he had achieved was available to all humans, that the 7 gates he had passed through were a path that anyone could walk if they had the commitment and the courage to do the inner work required. Now we need to address the question that should be arising in any critical mind at this point. How do we know any of this is real? How do we know these Gnostic texts are describing actual practices that produce verifiable results, rather than elaborate theological fantasies or early Christian mythology? This is where we have to bring in both historical evidence and contemporary verification. The historical evidence comes from multiple sources. First, we have the testimony of the Church Fathers who opposed Gnosticism, particularly Irenaeus in his text Against Heresies, written around 180 CE. Irenaeus devotes considerable space to attacking Gnostic practices, and while he is hostile and often misrepresents the teachings, his accounts confirm that Gnostic Christians were indeed practicing specific techniques involving the speaking of sacred names, and that these practices were producing experiences that the Orthodox Church found threatening. Irenaeus specifically mentions that Gnostic practitioners claimed to achieve direct knowledge of God without need for church mediation, and that they demonstrated unusual abilities including healing, clairvoyance, and what Irenaeus called spiritual arrogance, which from a Gnostic perspective would simply be the confidence that comes from direct experiential knowledge rather than dependent belief. Second, we have archaeological evidence from early Christian sites in Egypt showing the existence of meditation rooms, small chambers built into homes that contain nothing but a simple seat facing a blank wall, identical in function to the meditation cells used in Buddhist monasteries. These rooms date to the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE and provide physical confirmation that early Christians were engaging in contemplative practices that required dedicated space and time, practices very different from the communal worship services that became standard in Orthodox Christianity. Third, we have the testimony of practitioners throughout history who have worked with these Gnostic techniques and reported consistent results. In the medieval period, there were underground communities of Christian mystics, groups like the Brethren of the Free Spirit, who preserved and practiced Gnostic techniques despite intense persecution by the Church. Their writings, when decoded from the allegorical language they use for protection, describe experiences remarkably similar to those outlined in the Nag Hammadi texts. Progression through distinct stages of consciousness, each characterized by specific perceptual shifts and capacities, culminating in a state of direct identification with divine source. In modern times, the rediscovery of the Nag Hammadi texts in 1945 led to a renewed interest in Gnostic practice, and over the past several decades, numerous individuals and groups have attempted to reconstruct and test these techniques. Dr. Stephan Holler, founder of the Ecclesia Gnostica in Los Angeles, has been working with these practices since the 1960s and has trained hundreds of students in the seven-name sequence. His accounts and the accounts of his students provide contemporary verification that these practices produce real, consistent effects: enhanced somatic awareness, emotional regulation, mental clarity, transpersonal experiences, and in advanced practitioners, the stable non-dual awareness that the texts describe as the opening of the seventh gate. Similarly, the work of Dr. June Singer, a Jungian analyst who studied Gnostic practices extensively, documents case after case of individuals who, through consistent work with these techniques, underwent profound psychological and spiritual transformation, moving from states of fragmentation and neurosis to states of integration and what Jung called individuation, the realization of the self. The question of whether these experiences are real in any objective sense is actually the wrong question, because what these practices demonstrate is that the very notion of objective reality separate from consciousness is a construction, a belief that dissolves when consciousness becomes subtle enough to observe its own operations. What we can say with certainty is that these practices produce consistent, replicable changes in how consciousness experiences itself and reality, and that these changes are profound enough that individuals throughout history have been willing to risk persecution and death rather than abandon them. The archontic fear, the reason the Church worked so hard to suppress these teachings, is not that the practices are false or delusional, but that they are real and effective, that they actually do liberate consciousness from dependence on external authority, that they actually do break the chains that keep humans trapped in states of fear, ignorance, and spiritual imprisonment. Let us now address the practical question: how do you actually begin working with these seven sacred names? The answer requires understanding that this is not a weekend workshop or a quick technique you can master in a few sessions. The texts consistently describe the complete journey through all seven gates as taking years of dedicated practice, with the minimum time frame being 3 years for those with natural aptitude and previous contemplative training, and 5 to 7 years being more typical for most practitioners. However, this does not mean you cannot begin immediately and start experiencing results in the first few weeks and months. The key is to approach the practice with realistic expectations and with commitment to the long-term journey rather than looking for quick spiritual highs. The foundational practice with the first name, IEOU, should be your focus for a minimum of 3 months before you even consider moving to the second name. This might sound excessive, but the reason for this extended time frame is that the opening of the first gate, the development of stable etheric awareness, is the foundation for everything that follows. If you rush through this stage, if you move to the second name before the first gate is genuinely open, you will simply be speaking sounds without any real transformation occurring. The practice structure for the first 3 months should be 20 minutes per day, ideally at the same time each day to establish neurological patterning. You sit comfortably with your spine upright. You spend the first 5 minutes simply settling into physical awareness, feeling the weight of your body, the rhythm of your breath, the subtle sensations that are always present but usually ignored. Then you speak the name IEOU, 1 repetition per exhalation, maintaining full presence with each repetition, feeling the sound vibrating through your body. 20 minutes will give you approximately 80 to 100 repetitions depending on your breath rhythm. After completing your repetitions, sit for 5 more minutes in silence, simply observing what has shifted in your somatic awareness. What you're looking for is a signal that the first gate is beginning to open, a consistent sense of tingling or streaming in your hands and feet, a feeling that your body boundaries are less solid, occasional spontaneous movements of energy through your spine or torso, and most importantly, the development of what we might call proprioceptive awareness, the ability to feel the internal space of your body in 3 dimensions. Once these signs are stable, once they are present not just during practice, but beginning to persist throughout your day as a background awareness, you can begin adding the second name to your practice. You do not abandon the first name, rather you spend 10 minutes with IEOU to establish etheric awareness, and then spend 10 minutes with AOSABAOTH to begin working with the emotional body. Again, you're looking for specific signs. The capacity to watch emotional energy moving through your system without being overwhelmed by it. The development of what feels like a stable witness position, a place in consciousness that remains clear even when emotions are intense. The progression through the 3rd, 4th, and 5th names follows the same principle. You only add a new name to your practice when the previous gate is stabilized, when the changes it produces are no longer temporary practice states but have become your ordinary consciousness. For the 3rd name, you are looking for the ability to watch thoughts arise and pass without identification, for the capacity to hold beliefs lightly, for a kind of mental spaciousness that was not there before. For the 4th name, you are looking for a sense of vast inner spaciousness, for spontaneous insights into the nature of suffering and liberation, for moments where the distinction between self and other becomes transparent. For the 5th name, you are looking for experiences of knowing that transcend information, for moments where truth reveals itself directly rather than being deduced or believed, for a growing recognition of your own divine nature, not as a concept, but as a lived reality. The 6th and 7th names are in a different category entirely. These are not practices you can schedule or force. They arise when consciousness has been prepared through the first 5 stages. The text suggests that when someone is ready for the 6th name, they will be guided to another practitioner who can work with them, that the community aspect of this practice activates spontaneously when the time is right. For the 7th name, the texts say simply that the monad calls its own back to itself, that when consciousness has traversed the first 6 gates, the 7th opens by grace rather than by effort, in a moment that cannot be predicted or controlled. Throughout this journey, there are common obstacles that practitioners encounter, and the texts provide guidance for working with these challenges. The first major obstacle is doubt, the voice in the mind that insists this is all nonsense, that you're wasting your time, that nothing real is happening. The texts recommend working with doubt not by trying to suppress it or by forcing yourself to believe, but by treating doubt itself as an object of observation, by speaking the 2nd or 3rd name and watching how doubt appears as an energetic pattern, a contraction in the chest or throat, a particular quality of mental activity. When you can observe doubt in this way, it loses its power to derail your practice, because you see it as just another phenomenon moving through consciousness rather than as the voice of truth. The second major obstacle is what the texts call dwelling in the stations, the tendency to get attached to the peace or clarity or insight that emerges at one of the gates, and to stop progressing deeper. This is particularly common at the 4th gate, where the spacious clarity can be so profoundly different from ordinary consciousness that it seems like the ultimate destination. The texts warn that each gate is a threshold, not a dwelling place, and that the journey is not complete until consciousness returns to the monad itself. The remedy for this obstacle is to maintain connection with the tradition, to study the accounts of those who have travelled the complete path, to keep the vision of full liberation alive even when the peace of a partial opening is seductive. The third major obstacle is the intensification of archontic interference as the gates begin to open. The texts are explicit that the archons do not want humans to escape their control, and that as consciousness begins to free itself from the lower levels, there is often an intensification of mental and emotional disturbance, an increase in what we might now call intrusive thoughts or anxiety or depression. This is not a sign that the practice is failing. It is a sign that it is working, that the structures of control are being threatened and are intensifying their grip. The texts recommend meeting this interference with the stability developed through the earlier names, particularly with the witness consciousness of the second gate and the mental clarity of the third gate, recognizing these disturbances as external pressures rather than as problems inherent in your own consciousness. We need to spend time on the theological implications of these teachings because they represent a radical departure from both Orthodox Christianity and from much of contemporary spirituality. The Gnostic view that Jesus taught operational techniques for consciousness transformation rather than theological doctrines about salvation is fundamentally incompatible with the entire edifice of institutional Christianity, which depends on the belief that humans are inherently sinful and require external redemption. If the Gnostic texts are accurate, if Jesus actually taught that every human contains the divine spark and can awaken to their own divine nature through practice, then the whole structure of priestly authority, sacramental necessity, and church mediation collapses. This is why these texts had to be suppressed, why the church spent centuries hunting down and destroying every copy they could find, why possession of Gnostic texts was punishable by death in medieval Europe. But the Gnostic view is also incompatible with much of contemporary New Age spirituality, which tends to emphasize positive thinking, manifestation, and the creation of desired circumstances in the material realm. The Gnostic path is not about making the prison more comfortable. It is about escaping the prison entirely. The goal is not to manifest abundance or perfect relationships or success in the material world, but to recognize that identification with material existence itself is the root problem, that the entire structure of desire and aversion that keeps consciousness trapped in cycles of seeking and suffering can only be transcended by moving through the gates into the pleroma and ultimately into reunion with the monad. This does not mean that Gnostics are world-denying in the sense of hating physical existence. Rather, they see physical existence as a teaching realm, a place where consciousness can learn and develop, but not as the ultimate reality to which consciousness should be bound. The Gnostic cosmology also provides a framework for understanding evil that is more sophisticated than either the Orthodox Christian view that attributes everything to divine will or the New Age view that denies the existence of genuine malevolence. The Archons are not evil in the sense of being opposed to goodness. They are ignorant and limited beings who genuinely believe they are the highest authority and who structure reality according to their limited understanding. The demiurge who created the material world is described not as Satan or as pure evil, but as a flawed craftsman, an entity who had some creative power, but who lacked wisdom, who made a realm that is inherently deficient because he himself was deficient in gnosis. The Archons who serve the demiurge are similarly portrayed as beings doing what they genuinely believe is correct, maintaining order and structure in the material realm, not understanding that they are preventing consciousness from accessing higher levels of reality that they themselves cannot perceive. This cosmology has profound implications for how we understand suffering and injustice in the world. From the Gnostic perspective, the existence of suffering is not evidence of divine cruelty or divine absence, but is rather the inevitable result of a world created by a limited creator, a world structured to maintain itself through cycles of generation and corruption, through the endless drama of birth and death, desire and aversion, gain and loss. Liberation comes not through attempting to fix this system, not through trying to make the material realm into the heaven it was never designed to be, but through recognizing its true nature and developing the capacity to move through it without being bound by it. This does not mean that Gnostics are indifferent to suffering, or that they do not work to reduce harm. Rather, They understand that true compassion comes from the awakened state, from consciousness that has freed itself from the archontic realms and can therefore act in the world with clarity rather than from reactive patterns of the emotional and mental bodies. The scientific framework for understanding how these practices work is still being developed, but there are already intriguing connections between Gnostic cosmology and contemporary neuroscience and physics. The multi-layered structure of reality that the Gnostic texts describe maps remarkably well onto current models of consciousness in neuroscience, which recognize that there are multiple levels of processing, from basic sensory input at the level of the brainstem, through emotional processing in the limbic system, through conceptual processing in the cortex, through the integration of all these levels into unified conscious experience. The Gnostic names could be understood as techniques for bringing conscious awareness to each of these levels in sequence, for developing the capacity to differentiate between levels that normally function unconsciously, and for gaining voluntary control over processes that are usually automatic. From a physics perspective, the Gnostic notion that reality consists of nested levels of subtlety, from dense matter through increasingly subtle energetic realms, parallels contemporary understandings of quantum fields, of the zero-point field, of the implicate and explicate orders that physicist David Bohm described. The idea that consciousness can move through these levels, can learn to operate at frequencies beyond the physical, is not inconsistent with models of consciousness that see it not as an emergent property of brain matter, but as a fundamental feature of reality that can interface with matter at different scales. Obviously, none of this constitutes proof in any scientific sense, but it suggests that the Gnostic framework is not simply prescientific superstition, but may actually be describing real structures of consciousness and reality using the language and concepts available to practitioners 2,000 years ago. The practice of the seven names also intersects with what is known in contemplative traditions as energy work, or subtle body cultivation. The yogic traditions of India, the Qigong traditions of China, the Kabbalistic traditions of Judaism, all describe techniques for working with subtle energies, for opening channels and centers in the body that allow consciousness to access higher states and capacities. The Gnostic names can be understood as Western techniques for achieving similar results, using sound and intention rather than physical postures or breath manipulation as the primary tool. The advantage of the vocal approach is that it is accessible to almost anyone regardless of physical condition or flexibility, and it produces effects that are often more immediate and dramatic than a purely concentration-based practices, because sound creates actual vibration that impacts the physical and subtle bodies directly, rather than requiring years of mental training to achieve similar effects. We should examine the relationship between these seven names and the sacramental system that Orthodox Christianity developed. The seven sacraments of Catholicism, baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, confession, marriage, ordination, and last rites, can be understood as exoteric versions, degraded versions, of the seven gates that the Gnostic names open. Baptism corresponds to the first name, the recognition of the etheric body, and the first stage of spiritual awakening. Confirmation corresponds to the second name, the claiming of sovereignty in the emotional realm. The Eucharist corresponds to the third name, the incorporation of divine wisdom into the mental body. Confession corresponds to the fourth name, the purification of consciousness. Marriage, understood esoterically as the union of individual consciousness with divine consciousness, corresponds to the fifth name and the gnosis of identity with Source. Ordination, the setting apart for sacred work, corresponds to the sixth name and the capacity to function as an agent of divine providence. Last rites, the preparation for death and transition, corresponds to the seventh name and the ultimate return to the monad. The difference is that in Orthodox Christianity, these are external rituals performed by priests on behalf of believers, whereas in Gnostic practice, they are internal initiations that consciousness performs for itself, with the practitioner taking full responsibility for their own spiritual development, rather than depending on institutional mediation. This is the heart of why the Church had to suppress Gnosticism. Not because the Gnostics were teaching something completely different from Christianity, but because they were teaching the esoteric operative core of Christianity that the Church had wrapped in layers of exoteric doctrine and ritual in order to maintain institutional control. The 7 names that Jesus taught are the keys to the kingdom that he spoke of in the canonical Gospels, but the keys that open from the inside rather than requiring a priest to unlock the door from the outside. There is a question of cultural appropriation and authenticity that needs to be addressed. These are ancient Christian practices that emerged in a specific historical and cultural context, and there is a legitimate concern about whether modern Western practitioners, most of whom have no connection to early Christian communities or to Middle Eastern culture, have any right to work with these techniques. The response from the Gnostic tradition itself is that Gnosis is universal, that the capacity for direct spiritual knowing is inherent in all humans regardless of cultural background, and that while the 7 names came through a particular cultural channel, they are not the property of that culture, but are tools for human liberation that belong to all humanity. The texts themselves support this interpretation. The Gospel of the Egyptians explicitly states that these teachings were given not just to the descendants of Israel, but to all nations, that Jesus as a fully awakened being was operating from a universal consciousness that transcended tribal or national boundaries. That said, there is value in understanding the historical and cultural context from which these practices emerged, in studying the Coptic language in which the texts were preserved, in learning about the actual lives and struggles of the early Gnostic communities who practiced these techniques under threat of persecution. The more you understand the context, the more the practices come alive, because you connect not just with the techniques themselves, but with the lineage of practitioners who have kept this knowledge alive across 2 millennia. There are modern Gnostic churches and communities that maintain connection to this lineage, that provide training in the practices and community support for those walking the path. And while it is possible to work with the names as a solitary practitioner, there is immense value in connecting with others who are engaged in the same work, who can provide guidance, feedback, and the communal energy that the text indicate is essential for working with the 6th and 7th gates. For those who want to begin this practice, here is a realistic 30-day roadmap for getting started. Days 1 through 10. Establish a daily practice of sitting in silence for 20 minutes, simply observing your breath and your bodily sensations without trying to achieve any particular state, without speaking any names. This might seem like a waste of time if you're eager to get to the actual practice, but it is essential for developing the baseline awareness and stability that the name practice requires. Days 11 through 20. Begin speaking the first name, I-E-O-U, 20 minutes per day, using the pronunciation and intention described earlier in this document. Keep a journal of your experiences, noting any shifts in somatic awareness, any unusual sensations, any resistance or difficulty that arises. Days 21 through 30. Continue with the first name, but now begin experimenting with speaking it at different times of day, in different postures, in different environments, to discover what conditions support your practice most effectively. Some people find that early morning practice is most powerful, others find evening practice more effective, and you need to discover your own rhythm through experimentation. At the end of 30 days, assess where you are. If you have been consistent with the practice, if you have genuinely spent 20 minutes per day speaking the first name with full presence, you should be noticing shifts in your somatic awareness, in your energy levels, in your emotional stability. If you're not noticing any changes, the problem is most likely one of 3 things. You're not being fully present during the practice, you're maintaining mental commentary and judgment rather than simply doing the practice, or you're looking for dramatic fireworks rather than noticing the subtle shifts that are actually occurring. The solution in all three cases is the same: return to simplicity, return to just speaking the name and feeling the vibration without expectation, without judgment, with nothing but curiosity about what is actually happening in this moment. After the initial 30-day period, if you're experiencing clear signs that the first gate is beginning to open, you can continue with the first name for another 60 to 90 days before adding the second name. If you're not experiencing clear signs, you should continue with the first name for a longer period, possibly 3 to 6 months, before adding anything else. The principle here is that depth is more important than breadth, that opening one gate fully is infinitely more valuable than partially opening several gates. The entire journey is about learning to differentiate levels of reality that are normally conflated, about developing precision of awareness, and that requires patience and consistency rather than spiritual ambition. A word about the difference between information and transformation. You have now read approximately 15,000 words about the 7 sacred names, about the Gnostic cosmology, about the practice structure and the theoretical framework. Reading this information does not transform consciousness. You could read this entire document 10 times. You could memorize every detail. You could become an expert on Gnostic theology and history, and none of that would open a single gate. The gates open through practice, through the actual speaking of the names with full embodied presence day after day, month after month, year after year. This is not meant to discourage you, but to set appropriate expectations. Spiritual development is exactly like physical training. You can read all the books you want about exercise science. You can understand every detail of how muscles grow and adapt, but you do not get stronger until you actually lift the weights. The same principle applies here. The 7 names are not concepts to understand, they are tools to use, and they produce results only when used consistently over time. There is a question about whether you can work with these practices while also maintaining involvement with other spiritual traditions or techniques. The answer is that it depends on the degree of compatibility. Practices that are grounded in somatic awareness, in breath, in the cultivation of attention and equanimity, are generally compatible with the Gnostic path. Techniques from Buddhism, from yoga, from Taoism can complement the name practice because they are developing similar capacities from different angles. What is not compatible are practices or beliefs that reinforce identification with the material realm as ultimate reality, practices that are entirely focused on manifestation or on achievement in worldly terms, because these are moving in the opposite direction from the Gnostic trajectory, which is about liberation from attachment to material outcomes. Similarly, practices that depend on authority figures or on external validation, practices where you are constantly looking to a teacher or guru to tell you if you're making progress, can interfere with the development of the autonomous self-knowing that the Gnostic path requires. The 7 names are ultimately about discovering your own direct relationship with the divine source, and that discovery cannot be made by proxy. The relationship between the 7 names and the phenomenon that mystics in various traditions call Kundalini or spiritual energy deserves attention. Many practitioners report that working with the names, particularly as they progress from the first through the 4th name, triggers spontaneous kriyas or energy movements in the body, sensations of heat or pressure along the spine, visions or auditory phenomena, temporary periods of bliss, or conversely of intense psychological discomfort as old material surfaces to be processed. These phenomena are recognized across multiple traditions as signs of spiritual awakening, as evidence that consciousness is beginning to work at levels beyond the ordinary, but they can also be destabilizing if they arise too quickly or without adequate support. This is another reason for the emphasis on slow progression through the names, on making sure each gate is stabilized before moving to the next, because the energetic openings that the names facilitate need to be integrated gradually to avoid overwhelm. If intense energetic phenomena do arise, the texts recommend several stabilization practices. First, emphasize grounding activities, walking in nature, physical work, activities that bring awareness into the body and into engagement with the material world. Second, work more with the first name and less with whichever name triggered the intensity, essentially backing up to a more stable level until the system adjusts. Third, seek out guidance from experienced practitioners who have navigated these territories themselves and can provide perspective on what is normal and what might require additional support. Fourth, maintain basic self-care, adequate sleep, good nutrition, exercise, social connection, all the elements that support nervous system regulation. The spiritual path is not about transcending the body or the human condition. It is about bringing consciousness into full inhabitation of the body, into full participation in the human condition while simultaneously recognizing the divine nature that infuses and transcends all forms. There is a specific warning in the Gnostic text about what they call premature awakening or false gnosis, the state where someone has genuine spiritual experiences, genuine openings of consciousness, but interprets them egoically, uses them to reinforce a sense of special status or chosen identity, rather than seeing them as way stations on a path that ultimately dissolves all sense of special selfhood. This is the trap of spiritual materialism, where spiritual experiences become possessions that the ego claims and uses to construct a spiritual identity that is ultimately just another form of bondage, another form of identification with temporary phenomena. The remedy for this trap is rigorous self-honesty, the willingness to question your motivations at every stage, to notice when you're using your practice to feel superior to others or to avoid dealing with difficult aspects of your psychology or circumstances. The texts emphasize that true gnosis is always humble, always recognizing that any realization achieved is simply a return to what was always true, rather than an accomplishment that makes you special. The role of doubt deserves more attention because it is such a persistent presence throughout the spiritual journey. Western culture, particularly scientific and skeptical culture, trains people to doubt claims that cannot be verified through objective measurement, and the territories that the seven names open into are by their nature subjective, interior, not accessible to external observation or measurement. This creates a constant tension for modern practitioners. On one hand, you're having genuine experiences, genuine shifts in consciousness that are undeniable from the inside. On the other hand, you cannot prove these experiences to anyone else, and the part of your mind trained in skepticism keeps questioning whether you're deluding yourself, whether you're just having elaborate hallucinations or wishful thinking. The Gnostic approach to this tension is not to try to resolve it through belief or through forcing yourself to have certainty, but to maintain what they call Gnostic skepticism, a stance that remains open to direct experience while also remaining critical and discerning, that test claims against personal verification while not dismissing phenomena simply because they do not fit materialist assumptions. This Gnostic skepticism is actually what protects practitioners from falling into cultic belief systems or from surrendering their discernment to charismatic teachers. The Gnostic path is radically non-authoritarian. It insists that every practitioner must verify the teachings through their own direct experience, that no external authority can give you gnosis, that the only valid teacher is the voice of wisdom that awakens within your own consciousness as the gates open. This is why the texts were suppressed, not because they were promoting false teachings, but because they were promoting the kind of spiritual autonomy that makes institutional control impossible. If every person can access the divine source directly, if every person can become their own priest and their own savior through practice, then what function does the church serve? The church could only maintain its power by insisting that salvation required institutional mediation, and the Gnostic teachings directly contradicted that claim. The practical question of how to measure progress on this path is important, because the spiritual journey can be so non-linear so unpredictable that practitioners often feel lost, uncertain whether they are making progress or spinning their wheels. The Gnostic texts provide several markers that indicate genuine advancement. First, there should be increasing stability of attention, the capacity to remain present with whatever is arising in experience without being pulled into reactivity or daydreaming. This is not a peak experience, but a baseline shift in how consciousness operates. Second, there should be increasing capacity to feel sensations, emotions, and thoughts as objects in awareness rather than as self, a growing sense of space between the witness and the witnessed. Third, there should be decreasing intensity of suffering, not because your circumstances have necessarily changed, but because you are less identified with the dramas and stories that consciousness creates around circumstances. Fourth, there should be moments of spontaneous compassion, of caring for others that does not arise from moral obligation but from direct recognition of shared being. Fifth, there should be increasing synchronicities and meaningful coincidences, not because reality is becoming magical, but because consciousness is becoming attuned to the patterns and connections that were always present but previously unnoticed. These markers are cumulative and reinforcing. They appear together as consciousness develops, and their presence is a more reliable indicator of genuine advancement than any single dramatic experience. The texts warn repeatedly against evaluating progress based on peak experiences, visions, or bliss states, because these are temporary phenomena that can arise for many reasons, including simple neurological fluctuation, and they can actually become obstacles if the practitioner becomes attached to having them again rather than continuing the deeper work. True progress in the Gnostic path shows up as sustainable transformation of consciousness, as shifts that persist through all states and circumstances, as the gradual emergence of what the texts call the immortal human, the being who knows themselves as consciousness itself rather than as a body-mind that consciousness temporarily inhabits. We need to address the relationship between the Gnostic path and traditional morality or ethics. The accusation that the Church Fathers levelled against Gnostics was that their teachings led to moral relativism or even libertinism, that if the material world is seen as the creation of an ignorant demiurge rather than as the work of a perfect God, then material actions have no moral significance and anything is permitted. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the Gnostic position. The texts are clear that the purpose of recognizing the true nature of the material realm is not to justify harmful behavior, but to free consciousness from being trapped in cycles of reaction and karmic consequence. An awakened being, someone who has opened the seven gates and knows themselves as the monad expressing through an individual form, naturally acts with compassion and wisdom because they recognize all other beings as expressions of the same source, and to harm another is recognized as harming oneself. The difference is that this ethical behavior arises spontaneously from realized consciousness rather than from following external rules out of fear of punishment or hope for reward. The Gnostic ethic is one of responsibility rather than obedience. As consciousness awakens, as the gates open, you recognize with increasing clarity that your thoughts, words and actions create patterns in the field of consciousness that affect not only your own trajectory, but the field as a whole. You become responsible for the energy you put into the world, responsible for the impact you have on other beings, not because some external authority demands it, but because you directly perceive the consequences of your actions in the web of interconnection that the sixth gate reveals. This is a more demanding ethic than conventional morality, because there is no possibility of hiding from yourself, no possibility of rationalizing harmful behavior by appealing to external rules or circumstances. You know what you are doing, you know why you are doing it, and you live with the full awareness of the consequences. The question of death and what happens after death is central to Gnostic teaching, and is directly related to the practice of the seven names. The Orthodox Christian view is that death is followed by judgment, with souls being sent to heaven or hell based on their beliefs and behaviours during earthly life. The Gnostic view, based on texts like the Pistis Sophia and the books of Zhu, is completely different. At death, consciousness leaves the physical body and begins moving through the same levels of reality that the 7 names traverse during life. Consciousness that has opened the gates during life through practice knows these territories, knows how to navigate them, knows the names that open the doors, and moves smoothly through the archontic spheres and the levels of the pleroma back to its source in the monad. Consciousness that has not done this work during life finds itself confused and disoriented in the after-death state, susceptible to the influence of archontic entities who try to convince the soul to reincarnate, to return to material existence for another cycle of learning and suffering. The Gnostic view of reincarnation is that it is not the inevitable fate of all souls, but rather what happens to consciousness that has not achieved liberation during life. The goal of the Gnostic path is to break the cycle of reincarnation, to achieve what the texts call escape from the wheel, so that consciousness does not have to repeatedly enter material form but can remain in the pleroma, or can return to the monad permanently. This is the meaning of salvation in the Gnostic context, not being saved by an external saviour but saving yourself through the development of consciousness to the point where you're no longer bound by the laws of the material realm. The practice of the 7 names during life is essentially practice for the after-death transition. You're learning the route, learning the passwords, learning how to navigate territories that you will have to traverse when the physical body dies. This is why the practice is so urgent, why the texts consistently emphasize not delaying, not assuming you have unlimited time, because physical death could come at any moment, and the question is whether consciousness is prepared for that transition. The contemporary relevance of these teachings should be obvious. We live in a time when the archontic systems of control have reached unprecedented levels of sophistication. The surveillance state, the attention economy, the manufactured fear and desire that keep people trapped in cycles of consumption and distraction, the political and economic structures that concentrate power in the hands of a few while keeping the masses in states of scarcity and competition. All of these are manifestations of the same archontic principles that the Gnostic texts described 2,000 years ago. The difference is that where the ancient archons operated primarily through religious institutions, the contemporary archons operate through technology, media, economics, and politics, creating a web of control that is even more total and even more difficult to escape than anything the ancient world knew. The practice of the 7 names in the contemporary context is an act of resistance against these systems. When you develop the capacity to witness emotional manipulation, rather than being controlled by it, when you develop mental clarity that allows you to see through propaganda and deception, when you access levels of consciousness that cannot be commodified or controlled, you're breaking free from the system that wants to keep you unconscious, reactive, and dependent. This is not a withdrawal from the world or a retreat into private mysticism. It is the development of the capacity to function in the world without being ruled by it, to participate in the human condition without being trapped by it. The awakened being moves through contemporary society with the same freedom that the ancient Gnostic moved through the Roman Empire, recognizing the game that is being played, choosing when to participate and when to abstain, maintaining inner freedom regardless of external circumstances. The relationship between individual liberation and collective transformation is subtle but important. The Gnostic path is fundamentally individualistic in the sense that each person must do their own work, must open their own gates, must achieve their own realization. No one can do this for you, and your awakening does not automatically awaken anyone else. However, the texts also teach that consciousness operates in a field, that awakened beings radiate a frequency that affects the field as a whole, making it easier for others to access higher states. This is sometimes described as raising the vibration in New Age language, but the Gnostic version is more precise. When you open the gates, when you establish stable access to the pleroma, you create a kind of energetic pathway that others can more easily follow. You become what the texts call a light in the darkness, not through preaching or proselytizing, but simply through your presence, through the quality of consciousness that you embody. This creates a responsibility for those who undertake this path. You are not doing this just for your own liberation, but for the liberation of all beings, because every opening of consciousness contributes to the collective field. This does not mean that you are responsible for saving everyone, or that you should delay your own awakening until everyone is ready. The texts are clear that each being moves according to their own timing, and that you cannot force awakening on anyone who is not ready. But it does mean that your practice matters not just for you, but for the whole. That the work you're doing in your 20 minutes of daily practice is contributing to the gradual shift in collective consciousness that makes liberation increasingly possible for all beings. We are approaching the point where this text needs to conclude, though the subject is inexhaustible and could easily extend for another 20,000 words. The most important thing to understand is that the 7 sacred names that Jesus taught are not historical curiosities, not relics of an ancient and superseded worldview, but living technologies of consciousness that work as reliably now as they did 2,000 years ago. These are not beliefs to adopt, but practices to do, and they will transform your consciousness and your life if you have the commitment and courage to work with them consistently over time. The archons, whether understood literally as entities, or metaphorically as systems of control, continue to operate in the world, continue to work very hard to keep human consciousness locked in the lower realms, and the path of liberation remains what it has always been. The gradual opening of gates through which consciousness can move from imprisonment to freedom, from ignorance to gnosis, from identification with temporary forms to recognition of eternal source. You are ready for this work because something in you recognizes the truth in these words. Something in you knows that the surface-level spirituality you've been offered is not sufficient, that the real teachings exist and have been hidden from you, that you have the capacity to break through the veils and discover your own divine nature directly. The journey begins with a single 20-minute practice session, with the speaking of a single name, with the willingness to show up day after day even when nothing dramatic seems to be happening, trusting that the gates open in their own time when consciousness has prepared itself through consistent work. The texts promise that if you walk this path with sincerity and persistence, you will discover what Jesus discovered, what all the awakened beings throughout history have discovered, that you are not the limited, mortal, separate self you have believed yourself to be, but you are the monad itself, the divine source temporarily expressing through an individual form, and you can return to conscious recognition of that source while still living in the material realm, and ultimately return permanently when the physical body dies. This is the promise, this is the possibility, and the only question is whether you will do what is required to realize it for yourself.